Hello, and welcome to the Radical Mathematicians podcast. This is our second episode, and I think we finally decided on a name, Radical Mathematicians. But I'm here with my dad.
Here
Say
I
hello.
am.
All right. Anyway, let's start.
Who are we talking about today?
Brook Taylor. Have you heard of him?
Why are we talking about him?
Because I was helping my brother with his calculus homework not too long ago. Brook Taylor. Kind of an important mathematician.
Well, he lived around the time of Isaac Newton, and because too many podcasts and lectures and, YouTube videos are already up about Isaac Newton and Leibniz, we're going to try and do something a little different. So we chose Brook Taylor. He lived around that time.
We're just being a little extra here.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do what everybody else did. You got to have a little different twist.
All right. I don't know if we should be shooting that far off of the box in our second episode, but anyway, let's talk about Brook Taylor. Born in, what year was he born in?
Was it 1685?
And he died in
1731.
So
born in London, died in London.
He was 46 years old.
Yes, short life.
My man lived not a very long life, but he got to see what even happened in that time period. Did he see anything interesting?
Calculus, groundbreaking discovery and development of calculus. What could be more important?
I don't know. Usually with this stuff, you're really like, oh, he lived to see man land on the moon, or the discovery of the Americas, or some significant event. But anyway.
So Taylor was a little unusual as a mathematician because he's one of the few mathematicians who did not have a notable mentor, did not have any notable students, and did not attend any notable school.
Didn't he go to Cambridge?
Junk school. No. He was homeschooled until he went to St. John's College, Cambridge, but he was homeschooled until he was looks like 16, and then he went to Cambridge to study law, and then he got a law degree. His father was a very good musician and a very good painter, I believe, and Taylor was also a good musician and a good painter.
Yeah,
he had a very good grounding in the classics.
He did landscapes, I think.
But and of course he did learn mathematics at home. He had tutors, and he did write a paper, although it was published after he graduated. But he did write a mathematical paper that caught the attention of a couple of people who recommended him to the Royal Society after he graduated. John Machin, I think, probably mispronouncing it, and John Keel, who were two English mathematicians still known to this day.
You know they're English because their names are John and John.
I suppose that was pretty common in 1690 or 1700 or so. Anyway, he graduated 1709? No,
1714. 1714. He got 2 degrees. One was a law degree and one was...
Okay. And
What's an LLB degree?
That's a law degree.
What's an LLD degree?
Law.
They're both law degrees?
Oh, LLD and LLB?
Yeah.
I do not know the difference.
Well, whatever that is, he got it.
Okay, so that was when?
1709 and 1714.
Okay.
And he graduated and he practiced law for a little bit. He was in some sort of society called the Council of Arches, which sounds cool, but I don't think he was in it for very long before he decided to go more mathy, I suppose.
All right. Well, in 1715, he published 2 books. One was on perspective.
Like art perspective.
Yeah, but he took a very mathematical approach, and it was basically laying the groundwork for what today is known as projective geometry. This is a book about things like vanishing points and parallel lines meeting at infinity and perspective and things like that. It was supposedly very difficult to read. It was written for artists and architects, and no artist or architect could understand it. It was inscrutable.
How dare he make an art book without pictures?
His other book was more traditional math book, and that's where he introduced the Taylor series. Although historians are quick to point out that the Taylor series was probably discovered 40 years earlier by James Gregory. Although he didn't publish, apparently, and there were many specific examples of the Taylor series, for example, for cosine and sine and the logarithm and the tangent.
So basically a whole bunch of ad hoc solutions.
Special cases, yeah. I don't know about ad hoc, I guess, but Taylor came up with the general formula and he published. And it wasn't really known as the Taylor series until long after Taylor died. 60 years after, may have been the first person to refer to it as the Taylor series, Lagrange. And it wasn't even recognized as that important during his lifetime. Unlike some things that are named, some math that's named after people, he actually probably did invent it.
Are you specifically targeting a mathematician there? Like, is there shade being thrown?
Well,
someone got named.
He didn't come up with it in a vacuum. So there was a lot of research that was leading up to it. I don't think it's really taught, in casual high school classes that so many people contributed to calculus. It's just like, was it Newton or was it Leibniz? And there was a long tradition of development of concepts that led to calculus for, at least 50 years before Newton was born. So there was a concept of a derivative, and there was...
Was it Newton that said that famous quote, "He's standing on the shoulders of giants"?
I believe so, yeah. So let's talk about Taylor's life.
Oh, yes.
He wrote these 2 books.
He wrote the 2 books. He joined the Royal Society.
Mm-hmm.
He was part of the committee that decided whether it was Isaac Newton or Gottfried Leibniz was the one who discovered calculus. They voted for Newton, possibly because Newton was in charge of the Royal Society. He was president, and Newton was deciding whether he got the definitive credit for inventing calculus. So he's basically just voting for himself here, which, potentially a conflict of interest. He might have been better off recusing himself from that particular verdict. Do you want to talk about his life aftermath?
Well, he did a lot of work in a lot of different areas of math, and he ended up publishing about 13 mathematical papers. And he was very productive for about 12 or 15 years. Around 1720, he stopped doing math, and he met a woman, and he decided to get married and settle down. And he didn't really do much math after that. Unfortunately, his life went just straight downhill from there. So let this be a lesson to all the nerds out there. Stick with math.
Is that a threat? You pointed at me when you said that.
No, I was just wagging my finger.
Okay. Stick with math, or else here's what happened with the rest of his life.
Don't give up math for love.
Well, here's what happened. Here's what happened. He married in 1721. His father did not approve of the marriage whatsoever. He was estranged from his father. His father at one point said, I'll invite you back into my family if the first child you have with your wife is a son. It was a son. Great. He gets back into his life with his father. No. His child dies during childbirth, as well as his wife. And after a marriage of 2 years, he is a widower. I actually found this quote that is the most 18th century thing ever from, I think, an old Encyclopedia Britannica. Let's see if I have it here. We get his father. The old gentleman, however, found his heart relent when he heard of the pregnancy of his son's wife, and gave them to understand that he should be thoroughly reconciled to them, if the child when it was born should be a son. This produced so much solitude in the eyes of his daughter-in-law that when, on inquiring of the midwife of the sex of the child, she was told it was a boy, and she expired in the ecstasy in which she received the information. So, just to summarize that in case you don't get the old language, his father was like, I don't want you to marry this woman. This woman became his baby mama. The dad was like, okay, I'm fine with her as long as this child is a boy. If it's a son, you're still disinherited. This child was a son. When the baby popped out, the mother, the daughter-in-law, just got so excited that she fucking died. That's what the people back then thought when they wrote his biography, which just is the most 1700 quote ever.
Maybe that's sort of 1700, 1800, 1900, 2000 quote ever.
Then he marries again in 1725, and he loses his second wife also in childbirth 5 years later. They do have, the daughter that they have does survive this time, but it was too tragic for him. He got depressed, his health declined, and he died the next winter, never seeing his child grow up.
And it seems like his health was already declining when he married his first wife, although we really don't know exactly why. But he was not well for the last 10 years of his life.
He probably had some mysterious disease that people don't die of anymore.
And he died when he was, what did we say, 46?
46. He died when he was 46. All right. How about we get back and kind of backtrack and go into some of his contributions?
Let's talk about how nasty this commission was.
Okay, let's talk about let's talk about calculus beforehand and how we got to the point that we needed a commission in the first place.
Well, I mean, I don't know how they got to that point, but certainly in those days,
okay, how about this? Let's rephrase the question. Let's talk about how Newton was an absolute dick and how Leibniz was just as bad. And they basically just had a hissy fight over math for several decades.
Well, in those days, there was a kind of mathematicians. They were very competitive, and they wanted to get credit for their discoveries, and often were very secretive about it. And this goes back hundreds of years. And I'm not sure exactly what the dynamics were, because it's not really the way mathematicians work today. But they're more collaborative, right?
Yeah, math is totally collaborative.
But in those days, there was a lot of rivalries, and there was also, at the same time, there was this kind of love-hate relationship between the English and the French. Because of politics, and
you talk about it like it doesn't exist today.
The English, well, it was really bad then. So the year after this committee, Leibniz now a lot of mathematicians in those days had so-called patrons, people who would just, like royalty, that would pay for their lifestyle and allow them to just do math. And they would maybe teach a little. But Leibniz had a patron, and it was the, I guess, Duke of Hanover or something, Ludwig of Hanover, who was, I'm not sure his title. In the year after this committee, he became the King of England. So he moved from Germany to England, and he became George I, even though Leibniz was already an old man, he did die 2 years later. He kind of had no, I guess his financial support was withdrawn, and he did die right after that. And of course, the controversy raged on, but Leibniz was gone.
And not a single person went to Leibniz's funeral.
I did not read that, but I'll take your word for it.
It's on
That's
Wikipedia.
horrible.
I know, it is horrible. Apparently,
Well, I
people hated.
think it has a lot to do with this guy,
Yeah.
Ludwig, and I don't know if he lost friends because of that, but he was no longer in the court at that point.
And I would like to put in a little fun fact here. Both Leibniz and Newton died of the exact same thing, a calculus. A calculus in their
kidney stone?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. Well,
Yeah.
Leibniz was, I think, 70 years old. So they weren't doing surgeries. A lot of men died of kidney stones. If you got a kidney stone and you couldn't pass it, you were dead. You just did not survive that. It would just grow and grow, and you'd die in horrible pain. And that was one of the first surgeries that was ever invented. I think
I feel even worse for Leibniz and his.
Experimented on dogs or something before that.
I
It was
feel even
horrible.
worse for Leibniz and his funeral of zero if he died in horrible pain.
By the way,
Also, calculus, it's from the same word, the Latin word, or maybe Greek for stone. So people used to count with stones. And what do you call that thing with the stones?
abacus?
An abacus. And the word for kidney stone, calculus, comes from stone as well. So that's why it's the same thing.
Oh, that's
Anyway, we
interesting.
should really get back to
back
Brook.
to Taylor.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So
So this committee was incredibly nasty.
yeah, it was a setup, and it was after decades of nastiness. The British or the English claiming that Newton had priority, and the continental mathematicians claiming that Leibniz had priority. But during this time, each side was accusing the other side of plagiarism. And in fact, Johann Bernoulli wrote an anonymous letter to Leibniz accusing Newton of being a horrible person and plagiarism. And then Leibniz wrote a pamphlet, again anonymously, quoting this anonymous letter that he received from Bernoulli, claiming that
It's like
Newton
a game of
is
telephone.
a terrible person and a plagiarist, and we know that he's the author because they both fessed up later. But these were published anonymously, and of course all of Newton's friends were accusing Leibniz of plagiarism at the same time.
This was a couple years before Turnitin. They didn't have plagiarism
Yeah.
checkers. It was like the go-to insult, I feel.
The more I was reading about this episode, the less I thought of Bernoulli, because Bernoulli, not only did he accuse Newton of all manner of things in plagiarism, and Taylor, by the way, he also accused Taylor of plagiarism. Later in his life, Bernoulli, of course, the Bernoullis, they're a whole family of mathematicians, right? He had a brother, Jacob, who was a mathematician. He had a son, Daniel, who was a mathematician. Later in his life, Johann accused his own son of plagiarism. he loved accusing people of plagiarism, apparently. So, not a nice guy. I mean, who does that? Who does that?
Can you not do that with me? Please,
don't
please
worry.
don't accuse me of plagiarism as
We're
your daughter.
thick as thieves.
Isn't the whole point of thieves that they stab each other in the back?
No. Not when you're thick. So the controversy raged on even after this committee, this setup.
Brook Taylor was admitted as a fellow of the Royal Society on April 3rd, 1712. And 2 weeks later, he was selected to serve on this committee, which was in charge of investigating the calculus dispute. So,
Everybody on that committee was a good friend of Isaac Newton.
yeah. So Newton was president of the Royal Society, and I guess they just decided to let him choose.
So what's the truth? Who does have priority? Who invented calculus? Who, Sydney? Who?
Well, I learned calculus from a English textbook, so
it's
obviously Newton.
So okay,
I'm
so
sure
it's
the Germans think differently, though.
It's kind of universally accepted that Leibniz and Newton invented calculus independently. Leibniz published first, but Newton seems to have discovered some things earlier. Although he didn't publish, he did write letters to people documenting this. They just weren't widely circulated, but historians can read them today. But they were thought to have come up with these things, many of the things independently. So it's not like Newton, came up with this out of thin air. Newton knew about derivatives from Barrow. He developed integration. He had a very geometric intuition about calculus. Leibniz seems to have started from this.
Newton thought of it all as functions of time that shift.
Often, yes. Many times calculus was a means to an end for Newton because he was also made many advances in science.
He was more of an empirical type of guy.
He did it all. He did so much. Leibniz, I think, may have approached calculus in more of an analytic way, starting with infinite series and then doing integration, coming up with a general technique, and then developed derivatives, I think, maybe after. But both of them, I think, basically proved the fundamental theorem of calculus. Although there were earlier versions of the fundamental theorem of calculus that were put forward by both Barrow and Gregory. I read that they're not fully general theorems. I'm not sure exactly in what sense. The fact that the derivative and the integral are the inverse of each other. Basically, okay. That's it.
Speaking of the fundamental theorem and these letters that were circulating around, Newton actually discovered calculus slightly before Leibniz while he was at home during a pandemic.
Oh, right.
Leibniz heard of this new advancement, and he wrote to Newton saying, "Hey, I heard you discovered something really cool. I'm working on something that is pretty similar. I would really appreciate it if you kind of shared with me what you're working on, because I've got this cool new infinite series I think is relevant to what you're doing. Let's be friends." And Isaac Newton wrote back, "Hello, Leibniz. I already know how to make your infinite series. It took me about 20 minutes. I learned how to do this 3 different ways already. And these letters are not worth my time. This is just a child's note. I don't really feel like sharing anything with you because you offend me." And he wrote 6ACCDAE 13EFF7, and it just keeps going on. It's a cipher of the fundamental theorem of calculus written in Latin. So I can just imagine being Leibniz and getting this letter, being all excited that I was about to discover this new mathematical trick, and you just get this code saying you're not good enough.
Yeah,
which is an actual letter that exists on, look it up.
He was not the only person who did that. There were various ways mathematicians tried to establish credit for work without giving it away, right? Because they still wanted to develop
because that is the best way to do science.
Yeah,
just hogging it
days,
and
they would either write a letter and give it to a third party and say, this is a sealed envelope, don't open it. But if somebody challenges my work, then this will be proof. Newton used to write letters in code all the time. In fact, he sometimes was so paranoid that he would write his own notes to himself that he never intended to publish in code.
He was definitely a completely sane and mentally healthy individual.
Yeah, some of these letters between Leibniz and Newton and Bernoulli and Taylor.
Yeah, Newton was kind of a dick.
They were throwing some serious shade. 18th century shade. So, okay, so let's get back to Taylor and talk a little bit about his math.
So, Taylor was admitted as a Fellow of the Royal Society on April 3rd, 1712, and he was selected 2 weeks later to be on the committee in charge of investigating the calculus dispute. So, then 1 week after that, they completed the, trial and decided that Isaac Newton was the first to invent calculus.
Something that had been going for 20 years at that point.
Yeah, so they just grabbed this new guy off the street, was like, this is your decision. And apparently that angered a lot of the Europeans, the continental Europeans, because...
Right, so the whole committee was like a hit job.
Yeah, he got off on a bad note with some of Isaac Newton's enemies, and he had a lot of them. He did not leave a good first impression. Or at least to people like Bernoulli.
Right, Bernoulli ended up attacking pretty much everything Taylor ever published as crap. So I do think that it had something to do with this committee. So after the calculus dispute, Taylor went on to do some important math. We already mentioned he published 13 papers. He worked on one of the most important math he worked on was the mathematics of vibrating strings. This was kind of a big problem back then. A lot of people tried to solve this and failed, or only had partial success. I believe his first paper, which he wrote at Cambridge, was about vibrating strings or oscillating strings. And he eventually more or less solved this problem by coming up with an equation that described the exact shape of the string as it evolves in time, and which explains standing waves and frequencies and dampening and all the rest. It was known experimentally that the frequency of a vibrating string is proportional to its length, and also proportional to the square root of the tension on the string, and what else? Inversely proportional to the weight of the string, I believe. But it was not known mathematically why.
Did he just find the constant that tied it all together, or?
He basically wrote down a series of differential equations and solved them.
Oh.
And he was the first to do that completely, although a lot of other people worked on this problem and came up with partial solutions. There weren't that many mathematicians who, at that time, had a really deep grasp of calculus the way Newton did, but Taylor was one of them. So, some other things he did with calculus that Newton never did, he created integration by parts.
Wait, I have this guy to blame for integration by parts?
Yep, it's a standard technique taught even now, and he basically came up with that. I think he also came up with U substitution.
Seriously? Why did we do a podcast on him? I decide I don't like him. So basically I should blame this guy for all my hardships.
Well, think of all the math problems you couldn't solve without Taylor.
Think about all the math problems I was forced to solve because of Taylor.
Yes, but with substitution and integration by parts, those problems are so easy now. It's kind of a tool in your toolkit.
If I had known that he also invented integration by parts, I would have hated him a lot more than I already did.
Really?
In second semester calculus.
That's weird, because that's one of the reasons I love Taylor.
Isn't it really easy to invent integration by parts? Isn't it just the product rule?
Right, it's the inverse of that. He did some important work on strings and vibrating things, and he also published papers on capillary action and magnetism, figured out how light diffracts as it travels through like a layer of atmosphere of varying density. So this kind of explains why stars twinkle. It's because light is bent a little bit by the atmosphere. And
Was that
he
common
assumed,
in the time, assuming that the atmosphere had different densities?
yeah, there was an assumption that the air was less dense at high altitudes. And he kind of just made an assumption that it was proportional to the altitude. And based on that, he was able to come up with an actual equation using what was known about light. But this was,
That's pretty clever.
I guess it was known how light diffracted in things like glass, but it was not known if you had a continuous, like if light travels through a substance that's continuously diffracting it. Imagine the atmosphere as being like a zillion layers of very thin layers of glass, and it gets diffracted at each little step. That's, of course, a perfect application of calculus. And Taylor was the first to write a paper explaining that. And he came up with the correct equation for how light is bent by the atmosphere. And that was very interesting. He did some good work on rational functions. He did work on probability theory.
And these are all his papers, right?
These are his papers. Projectile motion, heat magnetism, and probably a number of other things that I'm missing. Oh, he did some experiments involving thermometers, different kinds of thermometers, capillary action.
I know that he is the first guy to think of the knights move puzzle, the problem of how to move a knight so that each of the 64 squares of the how to move a knight on a chessboard so that it touches
Every square once.
each square
and
once.
Only once. It's a famous problem. It's called the Knight's Tour.
Oh, the Knight's Tour?
Right.
Well, he was the first to formulate that.
People still study that.
Yeah, it interested me.
You can study it on different size chessboards. You can study it on infinite chessboards. You can study it on three-dimensional chessboards. So, it has some.
See, this is the difference. You're into the whole theoretical math thing. It really just caught my eye because it sounded like a computer science problem.
Oh, yeah.
I think
I'm reading here that he assumed that atmospheric pressure varied as the log of the altitude. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what he assumed. That's an interesting assumption. That's his paper on refracting light. Let's see. He understood and described the catenary. Do you know what the catenary is?
Is that the
St.
thing
Louis
with
arch. It's a hanging chain.
It's like a chain hanging under its own weight,
and
right?
it's also the shape of the St. Louis arch, except that's an upside down chain.
Oh, okay.
It's a very stable shape.
I didn't know that was
that's
supposed to be a specific shape.
Catenary. I hope I'm right about that. I've always thought so.
Okay. I've never been to St. Louis.
Interestingly, you have.
I have?
Yep, you were very little. We went to the arch.
Oh.
That's when
How
I went
old
to
was
the
I?
arch. You were probably like 4.
Oh.
It's basically an exponential equation. So why is the Taylor series so important? Why is it still used today?
To torture first year calculus students.
The best way I can explain this is to say that Newton knew how to take observational data and draw a line of best fit. And Newton developed the whole theory of drawing a line of best fit to data. It's known today that if you have 2 points, it defines a line, right? If you have 3 points, it defines a quadratic equation.
Parabola?
A parabola. If you have 4 points, it defines a cubic equation, right?
A squiggly line.
It's a squiggly line. Of course, if you have 4 points and they fall on a straight line, it could be just describing a line. That would be a degenerate polynomial, if you will. Anyway, Newton knew how to do this. So he knew how to turn a function, if you had, say, a function and you only knew what the value of that function was at, say, 3 points, Newton knew how to find the parabola that was the best fit. Okay?
And the best fit literally goes through the points, right?
Yes. What Taylor did was a little different in finding a general formula. He looked at these, say, 3 observations or 3 values of a function, and he looked at this very analytically. Newton looked at it as a scientist. For example, when he was young, he was able to take a handful of observations of a comet and extrapolate that to predict where the comet would appear next. And I think that was one of his early claims to fame. And he used this method to do that.
Did he credit math to this, or did
Absolutely.
he just try to be like a divine being who knows where the comets are?
He completely used the interpolation method.
If I was the first one to predict comets, I would say that I was...
Well, other people were trying to predict it.
I was an oracle.
Oh, this wasn't any comet, by the way. This was Halley's comet. But Taylor looked at this data and he said, let's look at this just analytically. And he said, if you have 3 points of a function, you have, in a sense, 2 derivatives of the function, right? The change from the first observation to the second and the second observation to the third. And because you have 2 derivatives of the function, you also have 1 second derivative of the function, right? The difference between the 2 first derivatives.
Yeah.
And he asked himself, what if you look at this like calculus and you imagine that there's more observations in between each other observation and you take it to the limit. So you now have an infinite number of observations and they're infinitely close together. And he was able to come up with this general formula. And this general formula is Taylor series. Now, I don't think it was recognized as having, the importance that it's thought to have today back then. And I mentioned that Lagrange was probably the first to recognize how important it was. But the reason it's important is because it means you can take any function, and if you know its value at a single point, right? This is not Newton's interpolation method now. This is Taylor's method. If you know a function and its value at any single point, and you know its derivative at that point, and you know its second derivative and third, and so on, all the way up, and you know everything there is to know about this one point on the function. Taylor series tells us that you can, as long as the function has a Taylor series and it doesn't have a bounded radius of convergence, which of course they didn't study in those days, under certain circumstances, you can recreate the entire function from just that one point, as long as you know everything there is to know about that one point, which means that everything about the function is encoded in that one point and in every point of the function. And that should be very surprising. It was surprising to me when I learned it. And what allows a function to encode... And
this is only for continuous functions, right?
Yeah, what allows the function to encode all of its information in every single point of it is another thing that should be surprising. The connection there is smoothness. If and only if a function is sufficiently smooth, can it then encode its all of the information about every value at every point, as long as you know all its derivatives at that point. And that's the Taylor series. Now, why is it important generally in math? Because it allows you to take a function and to decompose it. And, as a power series, you can decompose it into a linear portion and a nonlinear portion, or you can decompose it you can think of it as a linear and a quadratic term, and then the rest, which you can think of as an error term, if it converges quickly enough. And you can actually find out a lot about the function if you think of it as dividing it up into linear and nonlinear portions, because if you just take the linear portion and think of the rest as an error term, you can use all the machinery of linear algebra, which is very powerful, especially for something that's, very nonlinear. You can't necessarily solve things exactly, but you can come up with approximations and inequalities.
Yeah, you can
do a lot of
estimate
proofs.
shit.
Yeah, and it actually comes up a lot in proofs.
Engineering. Oh, proofs?
Proofs, engineering, a lot of areas of math. It's very useful. It's basically a tool. And it was also after, in the subsequent 100 years, mathematicians discovered other ways of decomposing functions. Taylor series was, I think, the first, but you can decompose functions in different ways. There's something called the Fourier transform, which is another way of decomposing functions. There's Mellin transforms. There's lots of different kinds of decompositions, and they're all very, very useful.
And they all are based on the concept of information being encoded in every part of the function?
Yes, very much so. The idea of decomposing a function into an infinite series is a very powerful idea. And it had its birth here with Taylor and Gregory and Newton. And that's one of the reasons I love Taylor, besides the whole integration by parts thing. And U substitution.
So one of the interesting things about the Taylor series is the fact that Johann Bernoulli thought that he invented it.
He claimed to, yeah.
He claimed to.
Well, he certainly, there's no question he came up with special cases. And he may have thought he came up with the general case.
Well, he was not happy when he read Methodus Incrementum.
Oh, that's it, yeah.
Methodus Incrementum. He wrote a whole bunch of anonymous attacks accusing Taylor of plagiarism, as he does, his favorite pastime. And Taylor did not help himself. He used these weird symbols. He used Newton's symbols instead of...
Leibniz's notation is much closer to what we use now.
Oh, yeah. Newton had that stupid dot notation, right?
Well, that's used whenever you have a derivative of time. Scientists tend to still use that.
Oh, I know. I don't like them. I don't like it when they do that.
I think he put the dot underneath, by the way. Somewhere in time, it was moved to the top. And
I actually
I think
looked at
Taylor
some of
actually came
Taylor's-
up with his own notation that didn't really take.
Taylor had a stupid notation too. He
just changed the dot to a kind of a slash or something.
No, I think he
I'm
had
not sure.
two dots on the bottom or the top, depending on if it was an integral or a derivative. So the dots,
okay.
I think, changed.
Maybe that's why his writing was so hard to fathom.
Oh, yeah.
Leibniz was way more concerned with notation. He wrote about notation and how important it was. He was more concerned than Newton was. Well, let's just say Taylor's notation is no longer used.
Yes. Well, I think the issue was he didn't use Newton's exact notation. He was like, I'm going to use 90% of Newton's notation, and then I'm just going to change it a little, which just is more confusing than if he just got rid of the whole thing and invented something new. He needed to commit,
Yeah. Well, Taylor's contemporaries all agree that Taylor's writings were inscrutable.
Yeah, he was.
In fact, his perspective book rewritten by somebody else because it was
it was
so
rewritten
hard to
like 3 times.
Yeah, it was not a good thing.
His own close friend said that a French guy said that reading it was like rowing in the galleys. He said it in French. Let's see if I can get this right. C'est jamais sur les galères que de lire et de voler entre de tels livres. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was like, this is as bad as rowing in the galleys. I hate this.
Oh, when he was reading Taylor's
he was like, I can't understand this.
I
It's
read that
horrible.
too. Oh, snap.
Yeah.
That's some serious 18th century shade.
I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. But
That's okay. We've probably butchered both the math and the history throughout this podcast. No one's going to care about your French.
You're supposed to be confident in yourself, you know? You're my father. You're supposed to teach me confidence. Okay.
Oh, no, I'm definitely all about humility.
So anyway, Bernoulli did not like Leibniz.
Well, let's hear the quote.
There's a few of them.
Give me your best one.
Ooh. See, I feel like it can't quite translate the 1720 shade into the 2020 shade. It's hard.
You probably can't do it justice, but give it your best shot.
All right.
You gotta use a British accent.
But Bernoulli was not British.
Oh, okay. You gotta give it a French accent. You're right.
His skills has hardly said anything that was not said before, and the whole book is written obscurely enough. I myself do not wonder at this, for how he can pass off as his own things which belong to others.
He's talking about himself.
Unless he affects obscurity on purpose in order to hide his thievery.
I think that was one of his anonymous letters. And then
I think that was a letter to Leibniz. Or maybe...
Yes, it was a letter to Leibniz. It was a setup, and then Leibniz quoted that letter in his letter.
He wrote a whole bunch of anonymous attacks. I guess I'll read off one of them. This is Bernoulli. Good God! What does the writer intend by that feigned obscurity of his, in which he cloaks matters extremely clear by their very nature? Doubtless in order to conceal his zen for stealing. For as far as I understand, as far as I know, I perceive in it the densest cloud of obscurity, nothing except which is stolen from us. So he's not very happy.
No, Bernoulli, I'm convinced now after researching this that Johann was truly dickish. What did you learn researching Brook Taylor that you didn't already know?
Is this the ending of our podcast?
This is how we're ending it.
Well, how about you go first?
All right. I learned that Brook Taylor has a crater on the moon named after him, which is pretty cool. It's a very attractive, perfectly circular crater. I saw a picture of it. I learned what quadrant it's in, but I tried to figure out where exactly on the face of the moon that quadrant is, and I was a little bit lost. I think it's kind of like upper left, but close to the center. I did in the picture.
Is it on the dark side of the moon, or
no? It's on the side facing us.
Okay, it's
you can look at it.
It's the good real estate.
The crater is not far from another crater named after the mathematician Hypatia, and also not far from a crater named after Immanuel Kant. So the toniest part of the moon, the best real estate in the moon. That was one thing I learned.
Fun fact, there are 186 craters on the moon named after individuals, and only 28 of them are named after women. And one of them is Hypatia. I read a book on this.
That's very 18th century.
You want to ask me the question again?
What did you learn?
What did I learn not about Brook Taylor, like an adjacent fact?
Anything interesting that you totally had no idea about before. Like, I had no idea that there was this crater named Brook Taylor.
Well, I learned that the house that he lived in, the Bifrons house, is a really nice-looking house. And it's named... Or, I don't know. I'm sort of doubting that it's named for this, but there is a demon named Bifrons. And he commands 6 legions of demons in hell. And I don't know how many demons are in a legion, but that sounds kind of impressive.
A Roman legion is 100, I believe. But...
So he commands 600 other demons?
Possibly.
This guy's like the big leagues?
I could be wrong about that. I'm going to get emails from historians telling me I'm way off. But You know, this is why his father wanted him to marry a woman from a wealthy family, because this estate was so expensive, the upkeep. And the Taylor family did not have a big income. They were made...
You know, today, I think places like Scotland will actually pay you in order to live in a castle and upkeep it, because it's just so expensive to get estates.
See, this is the problem. You're now segueing into a whole nother conversation, and that's supposed to be the very end of our podcast.
Brook Taylor's. All right, we should stop this.